across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about the defense budget, and there are some very good reasons for that. First of all, it is a huge bureaucracy. The Pentagon is enormous. The budget itself is enormous, although, as we pointed out before, the interest on the debt is actually now larger than the Defense Department budget, at least on paper. We'll get into some of the technicalities of that in just a minute, which is all the more reason to say maybe we need to reevaluate how much money we're spending. Earlier this week, we did talk about the fact that when we spend money in the Defense Department for some of these big budget items, those can be easily taken down by things like drones. And so there's kind of a rethinking about what that might entail as well. We've been privileged to have with us in studio a couple of times Pete Hegseth, who's now the Secretary of Defense. Back then, we didn't know that would be the position he would be in, but we wanted to give you a better perspective on that. So we come to another one of these young voices. We have a couple of individuals we've called on a regular basis, part of the organization called Young Voices, and one of those is Agustin Forzani. He has a bachelor's degree in economics from the National University in Argentina, a master's degree in economics from George Mason University, and has written this piece that appears in American Thinker. It is our third article there on the website. I guess it would be actually technically the fourth article, since we covered one other issue earlier, and it is called The Real Cost of the Defense Budget. So, Augustin, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me, and also hi to the audience out there.
Let's, if we can, start with your opening statement, and that is the United States is ramping up defense spending to nearly $1 trillion, despite claims to the contrary. It does seem to me that a lot of people say, well, no, I looked at the base budget, and, I mean, it's not small, it's $848 billion, but then you go, yeah, but forget about the fact that we also have money from the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill. So give us some accounting here. It seems to me we're spending more on defense than we realized we were spending.
Yes, the thing is, and also this always happens, the base budget for the Defense Department is, as you said, $848 billion, which is the highest of any other department in the government, and compared to the last year budget, it's just a 2% increase, because last year was $831 billion. So some Republicans in the government, lawmakers are arguing that this is just a small increase, given the huge problems that we have, that the U.S. has to deal with, in terms of geopolitics. You have like kind of two wars going on. So it seems a small increase, but you also have, as you said, you also have to add the $150 billion that was passed in the One Big Beautiful Bill, passed almost a month ago, which has some provisions that are defense related, like, for example, money for shipbuildings, for creating a golden dome. The U.S. is apparently trying to create like a similar defense golden dome, similar to the one that Israel has, and other provisions for weapons. So if you include that, which is in the other, this One Big Beautiful Bill, you end up with almost $1 trillion of defense spending, which is a 20% increase compared to last year. So it's quite an increase, I would say.
Well, again, sometimes the accounting tricks are hidden. This one is pretty much out in the open if people want to read through this. You mentioned the Golden Dome. I might just mention my commentary last Friday, August 1st, was on the Golden Dome and the argument that was made years ago, since, again, we've been broadcasting at Point of View for more than 50 years, but especially during the 1980s was, well, this isn't going to work. It was dubbed as Star Wars. At the time, it was called the Strategic Defense Initiative. People made fun of it, but we now see what the Iron Dome in Israel does, and that as a way to protect us makes some sense. But again, one of the questions that I raised earlier in the week is when you are spending a lot of money and there isn't a great deal of accounting, and when you sometimes are spending money on big budget items that could be easily taken out by drones, as we have seen both in Ukraine and then how Israel used them against Iran, there probably is a greater need than ever to reevaluate the defense budget. So one of the things you take on is how you look at defense spending compared to GDP. Can you speak to that issue?
Yeah, so that's the other point that I tried to make in the argument. That, I mean, talking about the Golden Dome, in my article, I don't try to argue against doing that or doing the other thing. I mean, this is just that I try to be objective, as far as I can, because nobody can do like a true objective analysis. But anyways, I try to say, you have to be careful with, the spending that you do every year. Otherwise, it's gonna go like if you don't take accountability on this, it's a problem, and as James Madison said, you have to also check the military expenditure, otherwise, it's gonna threaten the actual freedoms that you want to protect. But as you said, I make two arguments. First, we have to take into account that spending is increasing, like almost 20%. And the other argument is that it's not just as a percentage of GDP that you have to analyze defense spending, because if you select a specific indicator like that like spending, defense spending in as a ratio in the compared to GDP, well, yeah, defense spending is quite low compared to historic standards. But actually, you have other ways to measure the defense spending and how the government interacts in the economy, which maybe are not related to the amount that you spend as a percentage of GDP. For example, like the scope of the activities that you take into that the government
right.
takes carries out.
Let me jump in because I want to talk about that issue of scope, but we're coming to a break, so let me come to a break and we'll come back and talk about the scope, because I want to give you some of those numbers from this article, which again would suggest President Trump, Secretary Hegseth, maybe we should roll back some of that. We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Dr. Leonard Sachs holds a Ph.D. in psychology and has been a family doctor for nearly 34 years. He said he never saw a correlation between politics and parenting until now. He said left-of-center parents were no better and no worse than parents on average than right-of-center parents. He has now documented that children of politically liberal parents are more likely to suffer from depression and anxiety and a lack of sense of life meaning and have substance abuse issues. He's noted that over the past decade there's been an increase in what he calls permissive parents. They have been persuaded to carry out more gentle parenting because they don't want to be controlling to their children. In most cases, the children become the authority while parents try to be patient, calm, and punishment-free. His story from an article in the Institute for Family Studies illustrates this only so well. A mom brought her 6-year-old daughter into the office with a fever and sore throat. He asked the girl to open her mouth and say, "Ah." She shook her head and clenched her mouth. He asked the mom for help. Instead, the mother merely replied, "Her body, her choice." NYU professor Jonathan Haidt has been on my radio program to talk about his book, The Coddling of the American Mind. He believes that the real reason that left-of-center kids are more likely to be depressed compared to right-of-center kids is that left-of-center kids have been taught to catastrophize events, to assume the worst, while right-of-center kids have been taught to be more optimistic. You know, what is taught at home and what is consumed on social media is having a negative impact on the minds and mental states of children and adolescents. Political views and mental health seem to be correlated more than ever. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Agustin Forzani with us. We're talking about the real cost of the defense budget, and it is, I think, helpful to understand that, in a sense, the budget really is $1 trillion, and if you add all of that together, whether it's the baseline budget, $848 billion, to about the $150 billion that was in the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill, we're spending a lot of money, and it does seem to me that President Donald Trump, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, and others need to figure out how to reduce, in some respects, the size and scope of this budget, and more importantly, to make sure that the dollars are spent in fighting the next war. As we talked about earlier in the week, sometimes the mistake, we've seen this before, we saw it in the Civil War, we saw it in World War I, of fighting the previous current war with previous war kind of ideas and strategies. But, Agustin, you did bring up something about scope, and I wanted to get into that because that's another very helpful piece of your article, because you point out that since the Cold War, which ended in 1989 technically, the Pentagon has increased its operations from 40 countries in the 1990s to 80, so it virtually doubled the number of countries. At the same time, you have our U.S. Special Operation Forces, which have been deployed. It used to be in maybe 60 countries. Now that's expanded to 150 countries. And so it seems to me that if unchecked, we're going to eventually have military operations in almost every country in the world. And it does seem to me that we have heard from this president, we don't want to be the world's policeman, and yet we seem to be expanding more every single day. That seems to be what you found out with your research.
Yeah, that's true. Well, also the trigger of this article actually was an article that I read in the Wall Street Journal about, I think it was a lawmaker that was saying basically that, the GDP ratio, the defense spending compared to the GDP ratio is quite low in historic standards. And as I say also in the article, that's true. But you also have other indicators that show you that, defense spending is actually doing fine. For example, as you mentioned, you have operations. The Pentagon is in almost 80 countries today compared to the 90s, which was in half of those countries, and you have a special operation in 150 countries. It's quite a lot, even though defense spending is lower today than in the 90s. Another agency which was actually created in the 40s were the CIA and the National Security Council. Those two agencies, which you can argue that are not that transparent, those were created in a time when defense spending was quite high in this ratio. This defense spending compared to the GDP was quite high and was decreasing over time. but still you still have those agencies working today. So and actually these kind of agencies are, as I said, not that transparent, that you never know how far they reach, in the investigations that they conduct. And another argument that you can make also is, all the aid that the U.S. provides to other countries, which, President Trump is trying to reduce it, but you still have a huge amount. And there is another problem with spending a lot of, money in defense and overseas, which is something that I didn't bring in the article because it was going to be too long. But you have the problem of like a boomerang effect, which is called. It's a problem that you end up having when you have military spending, and you increase the military spending, and you have operations overseas, and then all those materials that you use, the tanks, the weapons that you don't use anymore because you produce new weapons for those places. It's incredible that they end up being used for the police in the U.S. This is another problems that you have. There are certain municipalities in certain cities which the police has, tanks for combating, the civil, for maintaining the civil, like controlling the city. This is insane. It's not a weapon to use in your own people. That's another problem that you end up having when you keep increasing the defense spending. So in this article, I don't want to argue that the U.S. should do this or should do that. I just want to point out that these are the problems that you end up having, and as a society, we have to decide what do we do with the money,
Very good. Well, I appreciate you writing the article, and you are one of the many young voices we've called upon. And if people would like to know more, we have this article from American Thinker, and it gets into some of the numbers that don't add up, some of the issues of the GDP misconception, you call it, some of the bottom line as well, and the need for us to be wise about the way in which we spend scarce financial resources, especially when it comes to the military. So, Agustin, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View, and thank you for writing your article.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let me just mention, just before we take a break, that I'm not against the military. Obviously, we are very for the military. But one thing that crushed my mind is how much, in light of reading some of this, we really needed DOGE to have spent some time in the Defense Department, which it did not, but how we could still maybe find some creative ways to deal with this. Years ago, those of you that listened to Point of View might remember that we used to have Representative Dick Armey on this program. He and Marlon Maddox got to be very good friends, and he came up with this idea of the Base Realignment and Closure Commission. And I thought it was very creative because one of the problems with the Defense Department is simply this. Everybody wants the Defense Department in their congressional district. And so, as a result, there were many of these military bases that frankly just needed to be closed down. But nobody wanted to close them down because, after all, having a military base in the backyard of your congressional district is something that you would fight tooth and nail. So, Dick Armey came up with an idea which I think we need to consider today when we look at the defense budget. And that is, he said, let's put together a commission, which was called the Base Realignment Closure Commission, and go through and evaluate all of these military bases in an objective way, and then submit those bases which need to be closed down, and only members of Congress could only vote up or down on the entire recommendation. Well, now you, if you were a member of Congress, would not be put in a position of closing down a military base in your own area. You wanted to close down many of those military bases. Everybody wants to close down a military base, but not the one in their own backyard. But when you put it that way, I think it began to have some cadence and some credence and really began to move the ball in the right direction. It wasn't perfect. I know that in some cases people look back and say that wasn't always that successful, but it was a way of maybe getting some objective eyes on this, because when you go from a time in which the Pentagon has had operations in 40 countries and now has it in 80, and when U.S. Special Operations, not even just a few years ago, was in, about 60 countries and now is in 150 countries, it's going the wrong direction. And we did elect President Trump, and we assumed that he would appoint a Secretary of Defense to try to figure out what we can do to begin to bring the defense budget under some kind of control. So I think that's a reasonable request. And so we wanted you to see one way of looking at some of the real cost in the defense budget, and so that maybe we can begin to exercise some fiscal responsibility when it comes to the Defense Department, especially given the fact that we do have, let's be honest, a military-industrial complex. Let's take a break. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer. And that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kirby Anderson.
Final half hour, let me just as a program note mention that tomorrow we're going to have Heather McDonald with us. We'll talk about her book briefly, When Race Trumps Merit. And one of the things we'll get into is the issue of DEI. And just down the road from us, last night, the Fort Worth City Council had to decide whether or not they were going to disband their DEI program. And if they did not, they would probably lose about $77 million in federal grants. So obviously you can imagine how that decision went. But it gets us into this issue of DEI. Also, I do want to ask Heather McDonald about the issue of how the press has been covering ICE, because as you've heard me mention, she was there and found a number of stories that were never covered by the press, which were very concerning. So we'll get into that, which also leads to, of course, a piece that we'll talk about before she comes on, in which the editors of National Review said ICE is not Gestapo. which is sort of obvious, but we'll get into that. And we'll also, of course, talk about the individuals, Democrats, that have been fleeing Texas, because then next hour we will have, for a while, Colonel Allen West. And I got a feeling he's going to have a few comments about that, as well as just he's been writing about the number of people in office that have broken their oath. You know, you're not supposed to break your oath when you serve in the military, which he did. You're not supposed to break your oath when you serve in government, which he has done, and so he's in a position really to address that issue. But I thought also as a program note, in the last about half hour of tomorrow, two very good articles come out on socialism. One by our friend Jerry Newcomb, another one by John Stossel. So we're going to kind of do a little bit of a deep dive into this issue of socialism. Of course, I have a booklet on capitalism and socialism. Also have another booklet on just socialism, the kinds of booklets you'd want to hand to a young person, maybe even some of the voters in the city of New York City. That's what John Stossel's writing about in terms of who his future mayor might be. So, again, that's just a program note for what will happening on Thursday. Then Friday we have Dr. Merrill Matthews and Liberty McCarter. We're going to be talking about a number of issues, not the least of which is how Planned Parenthood has been defunded. And want to get some comments, obviously, from Liberty about that, and also a very good piece that we will post by Marjorie Dannenfelser on that subject. So, quite a bit to cover, and in some respects, that is a reason for optimism, which brings me to this next piece by Stanley Kurtz. I mentioned earlier that Nathaniel Blake is with the Ethics and Public Policy Center. I think I first met Stanley Kurtz through Heritage Foundation, but I'm pretty sure, if I'm right, he actually is now at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. But he's talking about the idea of a cultural comeback. Then after the break, we're going to hear from, of course, Victor Davis Hanson's piece, which talks about why that's happening. And part of that, of course, is President Trump. But Stanley Kurtz asked a very important question. Is woke dying? Are conservatives actually winning the culture wars? Questions like these have been kicking around since President Trump's reelection, and they've only grown more compelling when we begin to see how poorly the Democrats have been doing. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar, years ago we interviewed a man by the name of James Davidson Hunter. I recommend any of his books, by the way, but he wrote a book in 1991 called Culture Wars, The Struggle to Define America. And he talked about some of the people who at that time were culture warriors, and the phrase culture warriors really sort of took off. I think, as a matter of fact, if I remember right, our good friend from Congress, and also having worked in the Nixon administration, Pat Buchanan, actually used the phrase when he was running for the presidency. But anyway, if I remember right, and I mentioned he wasn't really a member of Congress, but he was mentioned member of the Nixon administration and others. But nevertheless, that phrase culture warrior really kind of stuck. And so that's what Stanley Kurtz is talking about. He says, now let's be optimistic, because I think this is an entirely plausible scenario. What if the current Trump administration were to be followed by a two-term Republican presidency? We saw a 12-year Republican streak like this when Ronald Reagan's two terms were followed by a single term by George Herbert Walker Bush. He says another triple Republican streak would yield, and this is his estimate, I think it's right, a likely 8-1 Supreme Court advantage for conservatives, and President Trump's recent flurry of executive orders would have been in effect now for 12 years, whether Congress converted them into law or not. And so he says, well over a decade, Lyndon Johnson's executive order establishing affirmative action would stand repealed, as would all federal support for DEI, which is, again, the topic we'll have tomorrow with Heather McDonald. The government would still be doing all in its power to both keep men out of women's sports and to end gender reassignment surgery. So, he's trying to give you, is it possible to really be optimistic about the future? I think some of the concerns that I have about the future are more economic rather than cultural, but we'll see. He says, but first of all, if all of this happens, it will have been for largely the same reason we got 3 consecutive Republican terms in 1980s and early 1990s, not to mention Republicans alternating with moderate Democrats with Richard Nixon through George W. Bush. The center-right presidencies of 1968 through 2007 were reactions to the excesses of the early and late 1960s, as embodied in the presidential candidacy of George McGovern. But he also points out that even though we had Republican presidents, some of those didn't change. He says, for example, Richard Nixon, for example, despite all of his rhetoric, actually advanced Lyndon Johnson's policy of affirmative action. Ronald Reagan considered revoking Johnson's executive order on preferences, but defenders of affirmative action both outside and inside Reagan's administration prevented this. So as much as many people love to talk about what was accomplished during the Reagan administration, that was not one of those. He then goes on to explain, President Trump, by contrast, has uprooted Johnson's original affirmative action executive order, and for the first time has linked a conservative program of higher education reform to the continued receipt of federal dollars. Federal levers of power have been used across the entire range of culture war issues, often for the very first time on behalf of conservative goals. And so he then, of course, explains this idea of culture wars and James Davidson Hunter's book, and then points out that we've also seen some things that have been developing even more recently, and one of those is the case of Mahmoud versus Taylor, which we've talked about, in which the Supreme Court did argue that you can opt out of particular things that were being taught in the schools against your religious convictions. And more importantly, also points out that the movement for school choice has really taken off rather dramatically. So then he goes back and recognizes that on some of these cultural issues, it's been sort of a mixed bag. He says, for example, court-imposed gay marriage is now the law of the land. This has given rise, he points out, to the transgender movement, until recently seemed to be inevitable, but when you have now, as we've pointed out, the overreach and the attempt to try to have men and girls sports, gender transition surgery, and the rest, that has really changed. You also, of course, on the issue of abortion, have the Dobbs decision of 2022, even though abortion is still somewhat a practice, and significantly so. We'll get into some of the things Marjorie Dannenfelser talks about on Friday. That is the case. But we also see that some of the so-called culture wars have moved beyond abortion and homosexuality to things like immigration. And this is, again, one where I think Democrats oftentimes find themselves on the losing end, because providing cities for illegal immigrants, sanctuary cities, open borders, even some of the tax, as we'll talk about tomorrow, on ICE, which we'll also talk about with Heather McDonald, I think illustrate the fact that things have changed rather dramatically. So then he comes and says, well, our conservatives winning the culture war. And he said maybe right now it's tied, because they're certainly winning the controversies, but the left still controls the levers of cultural power, you know, what's going on in the universities and things of that nature. And, of course, points out that even the sexual revolution, as we talked about just a few minutes ago with Nathaniel Blake, are having a devastating impact on marriage and child rearing. But nevertheless, if you wanted to be somewhat optimistic, and I try to be optimistic around here, in some respects, the culture wars that looked almost unwinnable 2 decades ago are actually beginning to be won at a variety of different levels. And he begins to think about, what would it be like if you have a, say, President J.D. Vance and a Vice President Marco Rubio, or flip the two, that might continue for a while, and it could turn this country around in ways that people really didn't see coming just even a few years ago. So if you'd like to read this, it is a fascinating piece by Stanley Kurtz, and it's on our website at pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk about some of these cultural changes. Some of that has to do, obviously, with President Donald Trump. And so I thought we would end with this piece by Victor Davis Hanson. And if you read through it, it's going to sound a little bit familiar because I was just going back and finding the piece that I wrote on July 28th. My commentary is entitled Failed Experts because I was quoting from a piece there by Victor Davis Hanson called The Decline and Fall of Our So-Called Degreed Experts. Came out on the 4th of July, and in some respects there's an overlap. It's almost like part 1 and 2. And so let me end with this, and that is, he says, Trump's unknown frontiers. Donald Trump is rewriting the rules of politics, economics, and culture, and no one, not even the experts, of course he's already said that, knows what happens when the old orthodox finally breaks. And he's pointed out the fact that if you want to borrow a phrase from Star Trek, man, I gotta love the fact that Victor Davis Hanson at least knows the phrase from Star Trek, to boldly go where no one has gone before. That is exactly what President Trump has done. Because he says no conservative president has dared to question the last 70 years of progressive cultural, social, economic, and political dominance, all traditional wisdom, all of the renowned experts, self-described authorities who have no credibility. If you see an overlap between this one and the one by Stanley Kurtz, who's at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, I don't know if the two of them know each other, but they're singing off almost the same song sheet, even though Stanley Kurtz is in Washington, D.C., and Victor Davis Hanson is in Palo Alto, California. I suspect they've crossed paths many times. But the point he's making is this. We've heard from our legacy media, for example, that we're going to have a disastrous economy, that the United States Air Force better not enter into Iranian airspace. We see how that worked out. He says, well, just take the border. You know, we were told that comprehensive immigration reform was the only way we could deal with 10,000 foreign nationals storming the border during peak surges in the Biden administration. But guess what? And he gives us 6 reasons why that's different. No president has, number 1, pressured Mexico to close its borders and patrol ours. Number 2, announced a plan to complete a border wall along the entire U.S.-Mexico border. Number 3, stopped catch and release. Number 4, ceased refugee applications after illegal entering the U.S. Number 5, introduced policies encouraging voluntary self-deportation. And 6, prevented all illegal entries at the border. And so as a result, what has that done? Well, we talked about the jobs report the other day. He's got the numbers. 1 million foreign nationals have lost their jobs, and 2 million Americans have gained their jobs since Trump's inauguration. Well, what would that mean for the culture? How much trauma and cost will be avoided if 500,000 criminal aliens are deported? How many serious and lethal hit-and-run accidents will be prevented? How many emergency rooms will have more space for U.S. citizens? No one knows, but the consequences, he says, could be enormous. What about the tariffs? Well, we've talked about these before because, again, we were told the tariffs would destroy the economy. We'd have a recession, a stock collapse, stagflation. But guess what? We found out some of these importers pay a 15% tariff, still make a handsome profit, and don't necessarily always raise the costs on the U.S. consumer. And here we find ourselves. And we actually wonder whether or not moderate tariffs encourage rather than retard American enterprise. And that has certainly been the case. No one really knows the answers to some of this right now because we've never tried this before. But, again, to boldly go where no one has gone before. What about these $2 trillion budget deficits? Well, if these tariffs bring in some of that, maybe that solves some of that problem. But, again, isn't it possible we can begin to grow the economy? Because he says never has the government promised to deregulate and fast-track permits for construction, energy development, manufacturing from 2 to 3 years to just mere months. What could possibly be the financial consequences of that? Then he quotes from Interior Secretary Doug Burgum, who suggests that $15 trillion in foreign investments are coming, quite soon. What might that mean? Is it possible, he says, that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent could be right that $300 billion in federal income could come from new tariffs? If true, that would reduce the deficit by 15%. And, of course, he says then when we look at the universities, which is something he talks about so often, nobody's really questioned universities. And now we wonder about whether or not we can begin to address this issue of student loan debt that is spiraled to $1.7 trillion. Graduation rates have dropped dramatically. And so as a result, maybe when the government is now starting to hold universities responsible, as we talked about earlier in this week, maybe some of that would change. What about ending this idea of segregated dorms, safe spaces, affinity graduations? Couldn't that lead to more integration and assimilation? And what about maybe having admissions, which we're going to talk about tomorrow with Heather McDonald, based upon meritocracy, rather than rewarding those who maybe have the right particular ethnic background? How about rewarding those who study hard, and because of that encourage others to do the same and study hard? And maybe fewer administrators, more emphasis on instruction, less on politics, might really be a good thing for the university. And then finally, as he talked about affirmative action, something I just talked about a minute ago, of course, with Stanley Kurtz, gets into that issue, which I'll just simply ignore, and mention finally that when we even get into foreign policy, for the last 30 years, NATO was basically hollowed out. Most NATO members did not meet their commitments. Now they have met their commitments, and that has changed rather dramatically. We were told that you better steer clear of Iran because this supposedly unhinged, lethal bully in the Middle East is one that would be very dangerous. And yet today what we see is some of those killer surrogates like Hezbollah, Hamas, and Houthis either don't exist or have gone underground. And turns out that some of the threats were maybe just more than idle threats. So if nothing else, he's pointing out the fact that if anything right now, we're seeing some remarkable changes. Nobody knows what the long-term implications might be. But again, there's reason for maybe a little bit of belief in some optimism. And I thought we'd close with those two pieces by Stanley Kurtz and Victor Davis Hanson. And if you'd like to maybe pass those on to some others that maybe are a little bit down and discouraged, I think you're going to find that these are two seminal thinkers from really two different areas of the country with two very different academic backgrounds who nevertheless are pointing to some reasons for optimism in the future. But just before we go off the air, one last time, as we've mentioned before, we are a listener-supported program, and so we would encourage you to think about how you maybe have benefited, and can maybe ask you to pay it forward. This would be an opportunity for your gift to allow us to keep bringing these programs on the air to influence others in the future. And so your $10 gift, it's not a lot, but I'd encourage you, if you've never given before, to chip in. It's a way in which you can say, you know, I really appreciate what you're covering here on Point of View. I will continue to listen, and I do want to at least send you $10 to say thank you for what you're doing indeed. Again, all of the information that you might need for the conversations we've had today is on the website at pointofview.net. You can also, of course, click on that button that says Give Now. And I want to thank Megan again for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Heather McDonald, Colonel Alan West, lots of great information right here on Point of View.
You already know that Point of View relies on people like you, listeners, to stay on the air. And here's something that you might not know. Only 1% of Point of View's listening audience currently gives. You heard that right, just 1%. But we've done the math, and if every listener, including you, gave just $10, that would be enough to fund Point of View for an entire year. So here is my challenge to you. If you have never given before, please spare $10 to help keep truth on the air. Your support will fund the daily broadcast as well as additional resources that equip listeners to apply God's truth in their own lives. In short, Americans need Point of View, and we need you. Give your $10 online at pointofview.net. Or you can give by calling toll-free 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.